I was sitting in the JFK terminal on a chilly New York evening, watching the boarding process with a mix of hope and resignation. I'd been stuck there far too long, waiting for a flight back home to Charlotte. My name is Jack Trenton. Not long ago, my two sisters and I ran a small pharmaceutical company that our dad had started decades back, a company built on rare drugs that earned us enough money but never allowed for true growth. After our parents passed, I had spent days in New York hammering out a deal to sell the company to one of the big players in pharma. Finally, our lawyers closed the deal today. I was meant to be heading home tonight, but fate had other plans. The last flight to Charlotte was jam-packed, and I found myself third on the waiting list. I didn't dare call my wife, Katie. I had no good words to say. Instead, I sat at the airport bar nursing a second gin and tonic and replaying every detail of that deal in my head. The thought of over $10 million plus a cushy transition into the big leagues had me dreaming of a new life. My twin daughters, Emily and Olivia, were off at Duke, leaving Katie and me alone to savor what success might bring. As the final boarding call neared, the gate agents started herding the last passengers onto the plane. Then, to my disbelief, the boarding screen flickered, and my name appeared on the wait list. In that split second, I chucked my cash on the bar, exchanged a grateful nod with the bartender, grabbed my briefcase and duffel bag, and dashed to the gate. The agent there handed me my boarding pass with an explanation that a small group, 4 passengers who'd checked in remotely, had mysteriously not shown up. My heart raced as I ran down the aisle with my new seatmates, and when I looked up, I discovered I'd snagged a first-class seat. I'm on the right flight. And maybe, just maybe, I'm already one step closer to home, I thought. During takeoff, while the flight attendant politely offered me a drink, I ordered another gin and tonic. I sipped it as the plane taxied to the runway and then drifted off into a dream, one filled with first-class flights, carefree laughter with Katie, and a future where money and opportunity allowed us to live without limits. I woke with a jolt upon landing. After a few anxious minutes and a quick taxi ride from the airport, despite having driven my old pickup to New York days earlier, I finally arrived in Charlotte. But as I stepped out of the cab, an image froze me in my tracks. A sleek gold Mercedes parked in my driveway. It looked as if someone had replaced my usual ride overnight, a stylish, head-turning machine that didn't belong to me. Hesitantly, I walked toward the house. I recalled Katie mentioning nothing about unexpected guests when she'd spoken with my lawyer earlier that day. My pulse pounded as I unlocked the door and crept through the silent corridors of our home. My mind raced as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom. Then the door swung open and I saw it, the unthinkable. There on our bed lay Katie, naked and intertwined with another man, both of them sleeping soundly. I froze, unable to breathe as the shock washed over me. I had always loved the soft sound of Katie's nighttime snores, a comforting, familiar melody. But now, I heard only silence where that gentle purr should have been. For what felt like an eternity, I stood in disbelief, my heart shattering into a million pieces. Once the shock began to dull, anger ignited inside me. I fumbled for my wallet and cell phone. In that heated moment, I realized a violent reaction might seem tempting, but I needed proof, a way to show the world what I'd witnessed. I took out my phone and snapped a series of pictures, each click sealing the memory of betrayal. I gathered my few belongings, grabbed the duffel bag and briefcase, and stepped back into the night. Without a tear, I left our home behind, sliding into that gold Mercedes. Although I never cared much for fancy cars, I found a strange comfort in the luxury as I drove off into the darkness. I didn't know what the future held, whether it was retribution or regret, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to be the victim of this betrayal without a fight. After about a mile of furious driving, I pulled over to inspect the wallet left in the car. It belonged to someone named Brian Johnson, a senior sales manager at a local Mercedes dealership. His identification said he lived in Charlotte. Something told me that this Brian was Katie's lover. I weighed my options. physically confronting him or using this evidence to force Katie into acknowledging the truth. In that moment, the idea of a tennis racket as a weapon flitted through my mind, but I dismissed it as too dangerous and short-sighted. Instead, I resolved to use these incriminating photos to secure my future, even if it meant leaving behind the life I once knew. Meanwhile, back at home, Katie's day was just beginning to unravel. Katie was a cautious woman, but she'd been entangled in an affair with Brian for nearly 5 months without me suspecting a thing. That morning, as Brian awoke, he discovered something strange. His clothes and even his car were missing. I later learned that while he was supposed to be in Atlanta for a meeting about a new Mercedes S-Class, his world had turned upside down overnight. Distraught, Brian started pacing around their house, muttering about break-ins and missing possessions. Katie, groggy from the previous night's drinking, tried to piece together what was happening. When Brian's confusion grew into panic, he even contemplated calling the police. Katie's mind raced. How could she explain a stolen car and clothes? They had both been part of a chaotic night, and now everything was collapsing. Frantic phone calls were made. Brian reached out to his secretary Sarah to check on my whereabouts. Sarah assured him I'd been in New York working late on the sale, which only deepened his anxiety. In a desperate attempt to salvage some dignity, Brian and Katie hatched a wild plan. Brian suggested a cover story about his wallet being stolen from the car, hoping to divert attention from their messy situation. Katie, though conflicted, agreed that the plan might just buy them some time. Even as Brian attempted to tidy up his disheveled appearance, transforming a tattered sweatshirt and ill-fitting sweatpants into something passable, the situation deteriorated. It wasn't long before Brian's actions, including a clumsy attempt to re-enter the house through a broken window, ended with him getting handcuffed by the police. The local officers, already on high alert due to recent break-ins, didn't have much sympathy for his explanation of losing everything overnight. As Brian was led away, Katie's guilt and fear grew. In the aftermath, she tried calling me from the law firm where she worked, her voice trembling as she pleaded for an explanation. But the only news I had was that I was still in New York, tied up with lawyers and the paperwork that would soon seal our fate. The phone call ended with Katie promising to wait for me while Brian's misfortune unfolded further. Later, I found myself sitting in the modest office of Anna Parker, a divorce lawyer recommended by my longtime business attorney, Fred Carter. I explained everything: the betrayal, the golden Mercedes, the evidence on my phone, and Anna listened without judgment. Fred tells me that since you and your sisters owned the company before you got married, the shares and the proceeds are yours alone, she said. That was a small relief. However, she also broke the news that, given our income disparity, I'd be saddled with a hefty child support obligation, and worse, would lose significant assets over time. Despite that, the thought of staying in that poisoned marriage was unbearable. I signed the divorce petition that very morning and left Anna's office with a heavy heart, my mind swirling with anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of liberation. Driving the gold Mercedes back felt surreal. I wasn't even sure if I wanted the car or if it was just a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. I planned to hold on to it until the chaos with Brian and Katie finally settled. In a bizarre twist of fate, I even joked with Molly Davis, a resourceful friend who now seemed to be caught up in our mutual mess, about how the cops might verify if I got pulled over. Molly, always level-headed, reassured me that keeping the car wouldn't be a problem. By the time I got back to my modest motel, I still hadn't taken a moment to grieve properly. I called my daughters, Emily and Olivia, inviting them to join me for brunch at an old favorite spot on 4th Street. I knew I had to shield them from the worst of this nightmare, even as my heart ached with betrayal and loss. They were growing up fast, and despite everything, I was determined to be the steady force in their lives. That morning, over a rushed meal in a quiet park bench away from prying eyes, I told Emily and Olivia the truth in simple terms. "Your mom cheated on me," I said. my voice thick with unshed tears. I explained that I had seen the evidence, that our marriage was over, and that I was filing for divorce. Their eyes filled with tears too, and though they tried to be brave, I could see how deeply this had hurt them. I promised that no matter what, I would take care of them, fund their education, and help them build a future away from this pain. They listened quietly, nodding through their heartbreak, and I wondered if maybe, someday, healing was possible. After the talk, I spent hours alone in the silent confines of my motel room, replaying the events of the last 24 hours. I remembered the warmth of Katie's snore, a sound that had once been a lullaby to me, and how it now symbolized betrayal. I recalled every moment in the house when I had discovered her with another man, and the overwhelming feeling that my world had crumbled. I also thought about Brian's desperate, frantic behavior as he tried to make sense of the missing clothes, the stolen car, and the police intervention. It all painted a picture of a life spiraling out of control, a life I once controlled with precision and care. In the midst of that dark, sleepless night, I finally decided that I needed to confront the past head-on. I made a call to Molly Davis to check on the status of the car and our next steps. "Keep the car for now," she advised with a calm tone, adding that Brian was in so much trouble he might not need Katie for a while. I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy mixed with a bitter relief that Brian's fate might serve as a warning for everyone involved. Molly's steady, matter-of-fact voice was the only anchor I had as I struggled to piece together the remnants of my shattered marriage. The next day, I set off for a meeting with my divorce lawyer. In her simple yet professional office, Anna Parker laid out the facts and the next steps. She talked about dividing assets, handling custody, and protecting what little I still had. Despite the grim prognosis for our financial future, she reassured me that the divorce paperwork would be ready by the next afternoon. I left her office with a mix of anger, sorrow, and a glimmer of hope that I might rebuild my life, this time solely for me. Later that day, while waiting at home for news, I listened to Katie's voice on the phone. She was at her law firm, sounding distant and remorseful as she explained that she had come home to find me gone. The conversation was short and painful. I couldn't bear to hear her plead for forgiveness or to imagine her trying to justify her betrayal. In that moment, I knew I had to move on. I told her I would meet her at our old cafe later that day, a place where we'd once laughed and dreamed together. I wasn't sure if we could ever recover what we'd lost, but I needed answers. At the Center Cafe, I waited nervously as Katie arrived. Our eyes met, and I saw in her face the regret and pain of someone who knew they'd ruined everything. "Katie," I began haltingly, "explain to me, how many men have there been since we got married?" Her eyes filled with tears, and after a long, painful silence, she admitted to 3. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Every memory, every tender moment, was now tarnished by betrayal. We spent the next hours questioning everything, our past, our future, and whether any chance of reconciliation remained. I pressed for answers. When did she come home last night? What did she see in our bedroom? And did she even understand the gravity of what she'd done? Katie's voice trembled as she tried to justify her actions, but I could hear the finality in her tone. In that raw moment, I realized that our marriage, built over 20 years of shared dreams and disappointments, was irrevocably broken. I left the cafe with tears streaming down my face and a heavy heart, knowing I might never see Katie the same way again. Yet, amidst the despair, I found a strange sense of freedom. I began to envision a future filled with physical challenges and personal triumphs, running marathons, climbing mountains, even swimming across the Atlantic. I was determined to rebuild my life from scratch, dedicating it to taking care of myself for once. Maybe, just maybe, I'd even find a new love along the way. Returning home that day in the gold Mercedes, I was met with one last conversation, a call from Molly Davis checking in on me. "Keep the car for now," she repeated, reminding me that Brian was still in deep trouble with the law and that the evidence I had might someday serve as the leverage I needed. I couldn't help but wonder if holding on to the car was more about holding on to a piece of my former self than about any real practical use. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, quiet drives around Charlotte, and long nights spent reflecting on the life that had unraveled before my eyes. I called my daughters, Emily and Olivia, again, reassuring them that even though things were falling apart, I would always be there for them. We made plans for brunch and talked about school, work, and the future. They were hurting, but I could see in their voices a resilient hope that, in time, we'd all heal. In the aftermath of the divorce, I realized that every detail, the gold Mercedes, the incriminating photos, even the shattered pieces of our once happy home, would forever be a reminder of how quickly trust can vanish. I often think back to that cold night at JFK, to the moment when I learned that the life I knew was over. Now, as I drive through Charlotte in the gold Mercedes, I remind myself that every ending brings the possibility of a new beginning. I am determined to live for me now, to reclaim a sense of pride and independence that I thought I'd lost forever. I share this story not out of bitterness, but as a record of how life can change in an instant. Betrayal, heartbreak, and the slow process of acceptance have reshaped me. I've learned that while money, status, and even success can be fleeting, the strength to move on comes from within. My daughters, my few remaining friends, and even the rough nights at a motel have taught me that sometimes you have to let go of everything to rebuild a better life, one where I can finally put myself first. That's my story, a story of lost love, shattered trust, and the painful road to rediscovering who I am. And though I still carry the scars of betrayal, I now look forward to the challenges ahead, ready to face them head on, running marathons, scaling new heights, and above all, learning to live for me. This is not the end, but the beginning of a new life, one where I embrace the future, scars and all,